past Hadoop service concepts. In this section, let's look at Hadoop as a managed service in the cloud and what are the various features that we should be looking for when it comes to selecting a managed Hadoop service in the cloud. So what are the objectives? We will look at the managed Hadoop service in the cloud. We'll also look at the various managed Hadoop service features that we should be looking for when it comes to selecting a Hadoop service provider in the cloud. We'll also look at the cost model that may be offered by many of these providers. So you're ready to roll. You are ready to process lots of data that is coming into your applications because you have a wildly successful application. And so you need Hadoop. You have two options. Option number one would be to roll your own Hadoop, which is get your own hardware, install Hadoop, and do all the processing that needs to be done. The second approach would be to use a managed Hadoop service, in the cloud. Okay, so let's look at roll your own Hadoop option. Many enterprises have actually done this. You can roll your own, you could roll your own, and if you do this in the public cloud, you can use IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service. You can launch servers, you can install the Hadoop software, you can install the Apache open source Hadoop or Cloudera distribution for Hadoop or Hortonworks distribution for Hadoop or MapR, whatever you want. Configure the Hadoop software and run the operations. If it is in-house, then you have to buy the hardware, build, and there's a whole bunch of things that you need to do. The reality is whether you do it in the cloud or whether you do it in-house, it's a lot of work and the operations is heavy. And even if you roll your own, the cluster will sit idle most of the time unless you build some kind of a shared cluster within your organization so that multiple people can go ahead and launch jobs within the cluster. You could automate launching of the clusters in the cloud by using automation tools, but that's work too. So the point I'm trying to make is if you use infrastructure as a service, launch about 25, 30 machines and install hardware and use it, then the machines are sitting idle. If you do it in-house, where you have your own hardware and install software and things like that, you have to do work because now you have to do operations work also in it. And then what do you do when you don't have any work to do in the cluster? Now let's look at on-premise Hadoop. If you're going to be managing Hadoop on-premise, then you need to think about a bunch of things. How many servers do you need? How much storage you need? What if we grow too quickly? The on-premise solutions requires long-term planning and protection before purchasing hardware and the hiring staff that's going to be managing it. It requires most of the cost to be paid up front. It can also constrain the use of experimental and ad hoc workloads, inhibiting innovation. What I mean by this is there are so many sub-projects in the Hadoop ecosystem. You have bought your hardware, you brought your software, and lots of people are using it. But if you want to maybe work with a new version of software, you cannot really upgrade it because it's going to affect the rest of the guys. So that actually stops innovation. And you'll see in a few minutes how cloud solves that problem. It requires maintaining additional software in order to monitor the jobs and the nodes. You have to have complex data storage and iterative processing requirements. It's a lot of work if you have to do this thing on premise. Now, you can go with something like a managed Hadoop service in the cloud. And the idea here is that you don't really have to install anything. You primarily concentrate on the analytics and retrieving the business value from the data rather than procuring the hardware, installing the operating system, installing the software, operations management. You don't have to do any of that stuff. Just do your analytics. So why use managed Hadoop in the cloud? Reduce the hardware and the ops IT personnel costs. You pay for what you actually use. You don't really pay for people you don't really need. You don't pay for the capacity you don't really need. There's more agility and less wait time for hardware. You can have 100 machines tomorrow in the cloud and start doing your data processing. You don't have to waste time buying, racking, configuring servers. You can scale up, scale down, many server classes to choose from in the cloud. For example, AWS Cloud has several different kinds of servers. Servers that are compute intensive, servers that are storage intensive, servers that are network intensive. There is also less time doing Hadoop deployment and version management and more time actually doing the data analytics. So if you're going to be doing managed Hadoop service in the cloud, what are the capabilities that you should be looking for? You should be looking for the ability to create Hadoop clusters on the fly, ability to choose from distributions of Hadoop, ability to choose from various versions of Hadoop, ability to configure Hadoop cluster, ability to create clusters with different machine profiles, ability to use Hadoop ecosystem applications, ability to load massive amounts of data, ability to separate storage from the compute. Let's look at these in more detail. Create clusters on the fly. You should be able to create Hadoop clusters on the fly without pre-ordering any hardware. You should be able to do this using the console, which is the web console. You should be able to do it using API. You should be able to do it using tools. You should be able to accomplish all these things using any of these different technologies or approaches and launch your cluster very fast. It should be easy. Hadoop distribution. You should be able to select from several distributions of Hadoop in the marketplace. There is the Apache open source Hadoop, and then there is also the MapR Hadoop distribution. There's the Hortonworks Hadoop distribution. There is also the Cloudera Hadoop distribution. And there may be even a proprietary distribution by the cloud vendor itself. And you should be able to choose from one of these different distributions. So you should ask what distributions are really supported by the cloud provider. Hadoop versions. Hadoop software changes very, very fast. Of course, there's the Hadoop 1 and Hadoop 2. I mean, even within Hadoop 2, there are constantly new versions of the software. There are nightly builds that are happening. Stable releases are released every quarter. You want to make sure that the cloud provider is releasing new versions of Hadoop very, very fast. So you should ask the question, how often is the past vendor updating the Hadoop versions? Configure Hadoop cluster. Now Hadoop has a lot of configuration, close to 200 properties across core site.xml, HDFS site.xml, yarn site.xml, MapRed site.xml. The PaaS provider may configure some of the defaults and they may give good values for the defaults, but you need the ability to customize it because you know your application better and you may want to change certain parameters. For example, you may want to change the block size, you may want to change the replication factor, and so you need the capability to configure the Hadoop cluster. Does the cloud provider do that for you? Different machine profiles. You should ask the cloud provider whether you have the ability to choose between different machine profiles for the cluster. Many cloud providers have different profiles of machines. They may have CPU, memory, storage intensive machines, or even network intensive machines. And the question really is, do you have the capability to select when you launch your cluster to choose between one of these different kinds of profiles? And if you do, then that's a great thing for you. That's a plus in selecting that particular cloud provider. Hadoop ecosystem applications. Hadoop ecosystem has several sub-projects where several applications are coming up and they're growing really fast. Hadoop is one of the fastest growing ecosystem open source project. So as these new applications are coming up and are becoming mature, how fast are these ecosystems being brought in into the cloud provider's service offerings? That's a question that you should ask. So how fast is the PaaS provider adding Hadoop applications into the cloud? That's a question that you should ask. Load massive amounts of data. Organizations may generate lots of data, and that may be in your own data center or in their own data center, and you need to upload all this data into the public cloud for processing. The question that you have to ask is what mechanisms are available in the public cloud for loading this massive volumes of data. You should also ask the question if they are able to separate the storage from the compute. If clusters can be brought on demand, then there should be a mechanism to store the data in a cost-effective manner. You should ask your cloud provider, is there a mechanism to store the data in an economical way in a separate storage format, and then load the data into the cluster for distributed processing on demand when the cluster is launched? So as you can see, there are several questions that you can ask of your cloud service provider who's offering a managed Hadoop service. In terms of cost model, the cost model may be based upon several factors. The cloud provider may charge for commercial Hadoop distribution. For example, if you're going to be using MapR Hadoop, which is the M series Hadoop from MapR, then they may charge you for that. They may charge you based upon the type of hardware. For example, CPU intensive hardware may have a certain price. Memory intensive hardware may have a different price. They may charge you based upon the length of usage. They may charge you on an hourly basis. They may charge you on a minute basis. They may charge you on a monthly basis. The charge may be for storage. If you're going to be separating the storage and compute, they may charge for that. There may be a charge for data transfer. If you're going to be bringing a lot of data, there may be charge for data transfer in. There may not be charge for data transfer in. There may be charge for data transfer out, or they may not be charged for data transfer out. So you have to figure out what charges are available. So in summary, when it comes to PaaS Hadoop, which is managed Hadoop in the cloud, there are several Hadoop features that you should be looking for when you're selecting a managed Hadoop provider. You should ask whether you have the ability to create Hadoop clusters on the fly, ability to choose from one of different distributions of Hadoop, ability to choose different versions of Hadoop, ability to configure the Hadoop cluster, these different configuration parameters, ability to create clusters with different machine profiles, memory intensive versus CPU intensive cloud clusters, ability to use new Hadoop ecosystem applications, how fast are they bringing in these new ecosystem applications, ability to load massive amounts of data, are they providing you any mechanisms to do that, ability to separate the storage from the compute. And then in terms of cost model, there may be different factors. For example, they may charge you for the commercial Hadoop distribution that you may be using, or the type of hardware, or the length of usage, or the storage cost, which may be different from the data transfer cost.